Welcome to the Let's Talk Growth podcast, where we focus on the topics that can help companies unlock their growth potential. Now here's your host, Bill Hupp.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Let's Talk Growth podcast. As the intro mentioned, I'm Bill Hupp, and I'm joined as always by the founder and president of MarketWise Advising, Mike Haldane. Mike, good to see you. How you been?
I've been well, Bill. Thanks for asking.
Good. Hopefully you're enjoying your summer. Today, our episode is going to focus on pricing, which is always a hot topic and something that can obviously sway the success of products and overall companies. So I want to start, Mike, by asking, why is offering a price that represents quote unquote value so important?
Sure. It's a great question. And I guess maybe just to put things into perspective, let's take a step back and recognize where price fits in. So as we think about, as we've talked about in the past, the big marketing endeavor, it's product and product management, the things that go along with defining and bringing products to market. It's price, and then it's distribution or place, and then it's promotion, which is what a lot of people typically think of marketing as just the promotion P, but it's really all four Ps, and price is a part of that. So with that context, what I would say as it relates to value is that with businesses and when selling to government and when each of us as consumers buy products, we want to know that the price that we're paying is a value or it's associated with a value that is equal. So when we go out and we buy a car, we want to know that we're paying a price that's representative of what we're getting, the brand, the features, the longevity, the dependability, et cetera. And it's no different with any other purchase that gets made, whether it's B2B, B2G, or, business to consumer, the one that we're all most familiar with in our daily lives. And really it's a matter of just ensuring that what you're paying, it's equated to the value that you're getting. And that's really it. So now there are a lot of things that can go into the value, right? So it can be like in the car example that I just gave, all the things around features and longevity and that sort of thing. But it can also be, in some cases, especially on the consumer side, a certain amount of prestige, or maybe it's something about the customer experience that you might appreciate. It's, a level of service or what have you. So there's more to it than just the product. It's really the whole customer experience, the brand experience, the brand promise that goes into it. And each and every one of us, again, whether we're buying for our business or for ourselves, want to know that what we're getting is of equal value to what we're paying.
So when launching a new product or service, how do you make sure you get pricing right?
This seems really easy, but it's actually very difficult, and it's difficult for a few reasons. There are several ways to approach how to get to a price, and some of them are market driven and some of them are more internal driven. But, for example, we might start with, okay, we're going to present a price that is representative of what our finance folks want to see. So we know that our cost for a product is X, and we know that we need a certain gross margin on top of that to represent what will, actually be paid by the consumer or the business that we're selling to or what have you. And when we do that, it's a little bit of a simplistic approach because although it makes sense from a math perspective, from a finance perspective, it may not make sense to the market. And so, you have to look at competitive offerings. So most businesses have competitors. And when that's the case, there are competitive products or competitive services out there that we need to be in the realm of reality with, right? So we can't have a similar product or a similar service without some other reason to have a higher price. We can't have a price that's, let's say, 50% higher or 100% higher just because it made more sense to do it that way from a finance standpoint. So, what the market will bear is what you hear. And really what that means is the price needs to be representative of what the consumer is willing to pay based on what the competition of the rest of the market are doing. So in my mind, that's kind of that's the place to start. Now, there are things that factor in. So I mentioned, prestige, for example. So if you're buying a car that let's just say, has a BMW or a Mercedes, some other sort of high-end logo associated with it, there is a certain amount of prestige that some customers are willing to pay for. So mechanically, it could be just the same as a Honda or a Toyota, and longevity and reliability and all of that sort of thing may be similar. But in certain cases, certain consumers are willing to pay a premium to have a particular brand. And so that's when I say, value of the brand, brand promise, that's part of what goes into that. So that's one way to differentiate. You could say, well, I'm looking at some mid-range price vehicles. Some of them are under the brand Honda, some of them are under the brand Toyota. I know those brands are really well known for longevity, mechanically sound, quality features and that sort of thing. But then I'm going to look at a brand that's maybe not as well known for those things, and maybe I'm willing to pay, or I'm willing to sacrifice some of that brand promise for a lower price. And so, for the Honda and the Toyota and probably other brands as well, they're able to get a little bit of a premium because of their reputation as an automaker for decades. And so, when I say differentiation, those are some of the ways that that vehicles, for example, can be differentiated from their competition. It could be prestige, it could be reputation in terms of longevity and that sort of thing, or it could be something different. One of the things that I've had experience with recently is making decisions on price based on market research. So some of the things that I've been involved with have been things that are more solution oriented. So, some of the as a service offerings that we've talked about before, where you've got products and you have services. Some of the services are upfront, some of the services are ongoing, and you have a variety of other components that go into the solution to make it whole. And you start to wonder, okay, of the 100 pieces that go into this, what is the value of each of them, so that I can come up with a price that makes sense overall. And you can do something called a conjoint analysis, which is a market research technique that allows you to separate out those things and get a value from the customer's perspective on those things individually, and then you can come up with a price that way. Still need to test the price, from an overall perspective, but it gives you some view into where they see the value. And it's especially important when you might be considering trying to lower a price, for example, and you might be wondering, what can I take out of this solution because it doesn't have much value to the customer, and then how will that impact the price? So some pretty interesting work has been done on that front. Again, it's a market research technique that allows you to get to the very low level of what each of the components are actually worth.
What can you do if you've already launched, but then figure out that your pricing isn't right? Is there a way to right size that pricing in a way that isn't going to upset your customers or alienate anyone?
Yeah, this is something that is best avoided if at all possible, because you do have a little bit of a mess to clean up if you launch with a price that turns out to be not the price that you're gonna stay with longer term. And this is especially a problem when you launch with a price that's too high, and then you try to back up from that position, at some point in the future. It can be done. I've seen it done. I've been involved with projects where it's happened. It's not ideal, but if you need to adjust, you need to adjust. It can happen the other direction as well, where you launch with a price that's too low and then you have to increase prices later. But let me talk with the first example, or to the first example first. And, this is a situation where you've launched, you figure out a few months later that the price is too high, and then you have to back up from there. All you can really do is address the price, the new price, or the old price with the new price. In terms of how you message that and how you explain it to the customers, it's really kind of one of those situations where you have to take it, one project at a time, one instance at a time. The challenging part can be that if early adopters paid a certain price and then a few months later you drop the price, that's not great from a customer experience standpoint. So that's why I'm saying if you can avoid this, you have to try to avoid it. And the way that I would suggest you do that is by doing your research ahead of time so that you don't just, drop a price that really isn't realistic. In terms of prices increasing, so sometimes what happens, and I'll use the pandemic as an example, is that costs start to get out of control and your original assumptions start to become invalid. So maybe you said, okay, this as a service solution had a, cost of X and now it's X plus, some percentage. I need to adjust my price to the customer. That could be difficult because in a lot of cases when you're pitching these big solutions, you've got a price that might be good for, some number of months or the rest of the year or what have you. Especially when you're dealing with government customers, you typically have to give them a little bit of runway so they can get things approved and that sort of thing. But when the pandemic happened, obviously the supply chain got constrained and businesses all over the world had to adjust their prices. And in many cases, they were adjusting prices not once per year, but rather several times during the year. And each time they had to explain that, hey, our costs have gone up because the supply chain is constrained. There's more demand than we have product. And because of that, we're having to pay bigger dollars for the components that we use for the solution. And therefore, your prices has had to go up. So that happens too. When price increases happen, it's always good practice to use as an example, the way that it compares to inflation. So obviously, if you look at any of the financial programs right now, they're all talking about inflation and what the Fed is going to do with interest rates and that sort of thing. It's been a little bit out of control for several years now, really since the pandemic, and they're trying to tame it. But when inflation is high and your prices are going up as a result, you have to explain to your customers that that's why it's happening.
I would think that just like anything else, it's all about communication and communicating to your customer when you have to do a price increase.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up, Bill, because I probably would have forgotten to mention that. But, like most things in business, transparency is important. It's appreciated. The approach that I take is always, to be as transparent as I can, both internally and externally. And when I've done price increases in the past, I've explained to my dealer channel, to the distribution channel, as well as to end customers that we're doing this out of necessity. It's not because we're trying to grab more margin or anything like that. We're doing it because our costs are going up and we have to, unfortunately, pass those costs along as a function of, inflation, which happens most years. And again, in recent years, this happened at an expedited pace. So, yeah, I think transparency is critical, like with many other things in business.
Can you give examples from your career of where a regular price increase was the norm? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, I have been involved in businesses like that. In fact, on several occasions, there was an expectation of a regular price increase. Again, just to sort of match up with inflation and keep margins, similar from a percentage standpoint as to what they were in the past. Usually those businesses are pretty predictable in terms of, what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and their customers know that as well. So, when I was with 3M, for example, at least the division that I was a part of, had an annual price increase that they typically put into place, and their distributors and their customers knew that that was coming. So, a lot of times that would result in them doing a buy at the end of the year to try to, buy at the lower price because they knew that come January 1st, the prices were going to increase. So, when you talk about transparency, that's a pretty good example of how that can play out in a positive way. So, they did it consistently based on inflation. It varied in terms of how big or small the increase was based on what inflation was doing. But the customers knew and they could anticipate what it was going to look like just based on looking at, CPI and that sort of thing throughout the year. And so they could plan for it. And that, that's an example of a good customer experience. They, yes, the price was going up, but they understood why, they understood when, they understood how it was going to be rolled out, and they could make their plans based on all of that. And I've been involved in other businesses as well where, we had similar expectations. For example, when I was with Fortive as part of GTT, well, you and I together, there was a pretty regular annual price increase that would happen. And again, customers knew that it was coming. It was usually a function of inflation, and we were as transparent with it as we possibly could be, so that there weren't big questions looming.
Can you explain return on investment from the customer's perspective? And how about net present value?
So let's start with return on investment. So, especially when you're selling solutions typically have some sort of an ROI. So you might say, look, we're going to put a solution in place that is going to improve some process and provide some savings. Could be labor savings, could be cost savings, could be something that is going to drive new revenue streams, whatever the case may be. There's a value to that. So you say, look, if we don't put the solution in, the value doesn't happen. If we do put the solution in, the value does happen. And you look at that value and you say, okay, over the 5-year period or a 10-year period, usually it's 5, but over the next 5 years, what is that value going to be? And what is the investment that we make going to be? And then you simply divide the two, and it provides you with a percentage return on your investment. So, that's really it from an ROI perspective, but it's an important metric because customers look at it and they say, if I'm going to spend $100,000, but it's going to generate $200,000 in benefit, that gives me a margin of $100,000, right? I spent 100, I got 200 in value. The difference is 100,000. So if I take that $100,000 in benefit and I divide it by the $100,000 that I spent, that gives me 100% return on my investment over that 5-year period. And most companies would look at that and say, that's a good investment. That's something that we should do. And there may even be qualitative benefits associated with the solution. It might not just be financial. It might be that, by doing this, yes, we save money, we save labor. There's a value associated with that, a hard value associated with that, but it also is going to provide our customers with a better service, a better experience. It's going to, maybe put us ahead of the competition. It could be a lot of things from a qualitative standpoint that you can't measure necessarily with hard dollars, but they're still there. So that's the perfect scenario where you can say the ROI makes sense from a financial standpoint, plus there's this other value that comes from a qualitative standpoint that puts us in a better position as a company. So that's ROI, and that's typically associated with capital sales. I spent this amount of dollars from a capital budget. I got this kind of a return. My ROI is X. NPV is typically looking at things from the standpoint of cash flow. Might be that same period, 5 years, let's say. But here what we're talking about is putting a solution in place. Let's just say that it's an as-a-service solution, because that's the best example that I can come up with in terms of how to use NPV. So let's just say that that same $100,000 solution was going to give you that same $200,000 in value over that same 5-year period, except that you're not spending capital dollars, you're spending operating dollars because it's as a service. So the $100,000, just for quick math, easy math, is converted then to, let's just say it's 5 years, so it's $20,000 per year for 5 years for a total of $100,000. That's your spend, but the value that you get is 2x that, right? So you get $40,000 per year in value, but you paid $20,000 to get it. So your net cash flow as a result of that is $20,000 a year. And so from there, you can calculate NPV, and it's NPV basically looks at the positive cash flow and it discounts it for cost of money, and then it gives you a value. And if that value is positive, then you know that it's a good investment. So cost of money is typically what companies would use to justify investing in something that kind of goes above and beyond what they would normally do. So most companies use a 10% cost of money factor, and then they calculate NPV based on that. And again, if the calculation happens and the value is positive, then you know that it was a good investment because it gave you a return that was above and beyond that 10%.
That's interesting. And obviously with the Fed holding interest rates and whatnot, all those things right now are really impacting how businesses are choosing to invest or not.
Yeah, we could spend an hour just talking about, the interest rate and the Fed's role and all of that, and the impact that has on investments. But if you think about, times when borrowing money whether it be for us as consumers or us as business people, when the cost of money is increased, it makes it more difficult to make the investment because that ROI or that NPV, won't necessarily look as attractive when interest rates are high. And so it means that in theory, the economy, will start to slow down a little bit because investments that could be put off will be put off, just because the cost of capital is so much higher than what it would normally be. Now, in fairness, right? I mean, if you think back several decades, the interest rates that people are paying right now are high compared to what they're used to, but keep in mind that they were extremely low a few years ago, which was a little bit abnormal if you look at things over the long term. But still, for the last couple of years, interest rates have been higher because the Fed has been trying to tame inflation, and recent indications are that inflation is starting to become tamed. So the hope is that interest rates will start to come down, which will enable companies to hire and invest and do all the things that we like to see happen for a strong economy. But it's a complex, mix of trying to keep inflation in check so that prices don't have to continue to rise, and keeping interest rates, at a level where it encourages investment. So that's the balance they're trying to strike, and it has implications on both sides.
Like, I know you've built complex pricing tools over the years. For example, our as a service offerings, which we had at Global Traffic Technologies, and you introduced at a couple other companies as well. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into that?
When you're putting together, as we talked about a few minutes ago, when you're putting together a solution that has multiple components and, maybe the payments happen over a 10-year period, that's pretty typical. And the customer has maybe some upfront investment, maybe they don't. Maybe all the upfront investment is on the part of the company providing the solution. But lots of things need to factor in. It's not just a function of what are all the components. It's also, what do we expect inflation to do over that 10-year period? What is our cost of capital? If we're going to spend all this money up front to get the solution put into place, but we're going to get paid over a 10-year period, what's our cost of capital in doing that, and how does that need to factor in? Labor needs to factor in, not just today's labor, but labor over that 10-year period. And in a lot of cases, companies are outsourcing, they're contracting some of that work to third parties. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to be factored in as it relates to their price to you, how much it can be marked up, and that sort of thing. So those are all sort of the ingredients, the inputs into what that price might look like. And then from there, you have to calculate, with all those things considered, you have to calculate a price to the customer and then decide to hold that price flat for the full 10-year period, or if it's going to increase by some amount each year for that 10-year period. And then once all of that is determined, then you need to look at, okay, back to the original question that you had about price and value. Is this price something that makes sense to the customer, right, versus what the competition might be doing? But also as compared to doing this as a capital purchase. So you might say, look, a whole lot of reasons to do the as a service price and to go that route, Mr. or Mrs. Customer. But internally within their finance group, they're also going to be looking at, well, what are the alternatives? If we just buy this and provide our own services, or outsource some of those services, what would the total price over that 10-year period look like? And so those things need to make sense as well. And then finally, the internal financials of the deal. So you'll hear people talk about their company's P&L, right? How much profit, how much loss, based on revenue and costs and all of that sort of thing. But a lot of companies over the years have moved to a project P&L as well. And what I mean by that is, what are all the costs that go into the project? What are the revenues look like over that 10-year period? And how profitable was it? What was our net margin when it was all said and done, our net profit? And so, a good pricing tool will not only factor in all of the inputs to come up with a price, but it will also provide the customer a comparison of what it was with as a service, as an example, versus what it would have been with capital. And then it'll provide the internal folks to the company that is providing that service a view of what the expected profit and loss will look like for that particular project. And then further, what I've done in the past is I've also, as a part of the proposal page, made it apparent not just the comparison between capital and as a service, but also, if it's an as a service deal, what the NPV looks like, so that they know this is a good investment on your part, or it's not. And that just helps the customer make a better decision. It helps everybody involved know kind of where they stand from a financial standpoint. And in my mind, kind of back to the question or point about transparency, if you can be completely transparent with, what this looks like for them, what it looks like for you as the provider, everybody knows what they're getting into. And when you're signing a 10-year agreement, this is especially important. The way that I've done this in the past is that I would build a framework with, a spreadsheet with Excel. And that would include all of the logic that I just went through in terms of, kind of how the tool works, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and that sort of thing. And then, and that's a fully functional pricing tool that can be used, within an organization to price solutions to customers. But at some point, you're going to want to try to convert that into something that is part of the software that exists, within the company. So could be part of the CRM package or part of the ERP system as a whole. But you'll want to use some of the tools that they have to take that logic that you built, import that into your software application that manages the enterprise or manages pricing and that sort of thing, and then have that logic, provide the same type of functionality, but to do it outside of, having to use a separate spreadsheet. I've done it both ways. Usually you start with a spreadsheet to get the logic just right, and then you convert over to something like CPQ, which sits atop, NetSuite and other ERP systems, to be able to do that same thing, but to do it in a more automated fashion.
Well, this is a really important conversation, Mike, that has a lot of factors, a lot of inputs, and a lot of ramifications for both companies and customers. So thanks for chatting over pricing, and we'll see you next time here on the Let's Talk Growth podcast.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Let's Talk Growth. If you enjoyed it, feel free to rate and review the podcast. You can get new episodes and listen to old ones by visiting marketwiseadvising.com/podcasts. Let's Talk Growth is owned, produced, and published by MarketWise Advising, LLC.